Let's talk about the scientific method. From this section, I'd like you to be able to explain the scientific method, explain the steps that a scientist goes through to incur proper scientific method. I'd like you to be able to understand a hypothesis and why it's so important. And I would also like you to be able to formulate a hypothesis on your own. So how do you state a hypothesis and what should it sound like? It's also very important that you understand what what experimental controls are, why they're so significant, and also how to come up with them on your own. This is derived from Latin and means to know. And scientists use inquiry to search as a way to search for information and explanation. And there's really two ways that you can design scientific experiments. One way is just to observe what happens and go out into the world and take notes of what you see. So that would be more of a discovery science. A hypothesis-based science would be a more intellectual pursuit. So you might see something that you can't explain, a phenomenon, and in order to learn what is behind that phenomenon, you might design an experiment. And before you design the experiment, you might come up with a hypothesis of what is going on. And you will design your experiment around that hypothesis, using the hypothesis as your baseline of how to put forth the experimental conditions. So those are the two main differences. And ecology can be either one. You can go out and use discovery science to study ecology, or you can use hypothesis-based science. So let's talk more about both of these things. Discovery science describes natural structures and processes, so it's really just an individual or team going out and observing. So for example, whale migration. So you might put a tag on a whale and see where it goes and what it does and how long it stops in different locations and how long it takes it to get to different locations. So that would be a discovery science. This approach is based on observation and the analysis of data. So your tag that's attached to your whale might take months to come back to you, and then when it does, you're going to take that data and put it into get averages and speeds and dwell times and put it into graphs to show what exactly was going on. Data collection is the meat of the scientific process. We might consider two types of data. And data that we collect experimentally is always going to be objective data. We're just going to observe something and just collect the information that we get. This objective data could be qualitative, from the word quality. So that might be a description rather than a measurement, and we'll give some examples of that. Or your data might be quantitative. It might rely on numbers that we can measure very accurately. So measurements, right? Sizes. So in the whale migrating, a distance and a speed. Those are quantitative measurements. We can get a very precise measurement of how far a whale migrated, and we can compare that to the migration of other whales. That is a quantitative measurement. So a qualitative measurement might be something more like discovery science that Jane Goodall did, right? When she went out and observed chimpanzee behavior. So she spent years and years kind of living among them and observing their behavior and taking notes. Here's an example of some of her notes where she's describing what they're doing. And that might be more of a qualitative measurement or a qualitative observation. So we're not dealing with numbers and measurements that can be reproduced and directly compared individual to individual. It's more of a qualitative measurement. So here are some other types of qualitative data. For example, if we use pH paper, I don't know if you've ever used that in lab, but you get this kind of rainbow measurement, and you have to put your paper in the solution that you're measuring the pH of and try to match it to the closest number. So that's kind of a qualitative measurement. That's not an exact measurement. If we take our solution and use a pH meter to measure the pH, so the pH is a measure of acidity, that might give us an actual number. That would be a quantitative measurement. Other tests, here's another example of a qualitative measurement. Again, another colorimetric test of hemoglobin. When we get quantitative data, we're actually dealing with measurements that are hard numbers. So from that we can get tables of measurements and we can compile that data into graphs, bar graphs, pie charts, whatever kind of graph you like to use. In science, our goal is to collect and analyze objective data. That means that you're not influencing it with your opinions or your feelings. You're just collecting something that if another scientist came along and did the same experiment, they would be able to collect the same data using the same methods. And oftentimes when we do experiments, we're sampling from a very small part of the population. So that's important to keep in mind when we think about our results. So if you do a drug trial and let's say it's on a very devastating disease and you don't have that many people that have that disease and you don't really want to expose that many patients to a new drug that you don't know how they're going to react to, you might only be looking at 10 or 20 patients and testing a drug on them, and half of those are not going to actually be getting that drug, right? Half are going to be the control group that will not be receiving the drug. So that's a very small population, and from that you're trying to make an assumption of how that drug will affect the population of all people or all people that have the disease that you are studying. So let's talk about inductive and deductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning draws conclusions through the logical process of induction. And we might make observations, so we might say, well, the sun always rises on the east of where I live. And from that, you might say, okay, I think that I can make some induction, some generalizations about how the world works, how we are positioned with respect to the sun, based on this observation. Observations can lead us to ask questions and propose hypothetical explanations called hypotheses. So a hypothesis is a critical part of the scientific method. And if you are working in a lab, they are going to demand that you present and propose a hypothesis for every experiment you do. So what is a hypothesis? Let's talk a little bit about that. The hypothesis is a tentative answer to a well-framed question. So if you have an observation and you want to figure out how it works or what is going on there, what is the process that leads to that observation, you're going to formulate a hypothesis of how it works before you even do the experiment. You have to guess and make a conclusion before you have data. So that means your hypothesis might be wrong, right? You might not make the correct guess. But it's really important to have that guess, to design your experiments, and to have the correct conclusion when you do get your data. So a hypothesis is an educated guess. It's the scientist's prerogative of what they think is going on. A scientific hypothesis leads to predictions that can be tested by observation or experimentation. And again, importantly, the hypothesis is going to help you design your experiments. A hypothesis must be a statement. So when we design a hypothesis, we will say it in the form of a statement. It must be predictive of what we think is going on. It helps if it is as specific as possible. So if we have a hypothesis about whale migration, for example, let's say we're interested in how warming of the oceans will affect the migration of the whale population. It's important to be as specific as we possibly can be. So let's say that's our question. We're interested in how temperature affects whale migration and how ocean temperature. But our hypothesis will be, we predict, and you don't even need to say that part, so your hypothesis could be, warming ocean temperatures will reduce whale migration to the north. And that is a very specific predictive statement of what is going on. And it's also testable. So when we go back to the field and analyze our data and say, all right, well, during these times the ocean was warmer, and do we see a decrease in whale migration to that particular location? So it's very important that the hypothesis be constructed that way. So the hypothesis must be testable and falsifiable, right? Sometimes your hypothesis is wrong. Hypothesis-based science is often makes use of two or more alternative hypotheses. So you might come up with one, you might disprove it, and need to come up with another one. Usually we only will approach one at a time. Failure to falsify a hypothesis does not prove it to be true. So let's look at an example now, a very simple example that you might encounter at home. You might have a flashlight, and you might try to go turn it on one day, and no light comes out. The next step that here, let's look at the flow chart. Your flashlight doesn't work. Hypothesis number 1 might be that the batteries are dead. Hypothesis number 2 might be that the bulb is dead. And you'll probably test one at a time, right? So let's go through the batteries being dead. Let's say that's probably most likely. So our hypothesis is the batteries are dead, and that is why the flashlight is not turning on. So our experiment will be to change the batteries. We test that prediction, and the flashlight does not turn on, so it falsified our hypothesis. So we start over. Let's build another hypothesis. Well, maybe the flashlight is not turning on because the bulb is burnt out. That's a statement. It's testable, right? It's falsifiable. It's detailed, right? We've been very clear about what we think is going on. So our prediction is that if we change the bulb, we might fix the problem. We change the bulb, and then the flashlight does indeed work. So that, in a nutshell, is the scientific method. If you think back about the steps of scientific method and what the steps are, you can think about this example, and hopefully it'll come back to you very easily. So the first step of scientific method is always observation. You observe something, right? A scientist makes an observation. It invokes some curiosity. They wonder why something is happening that way, what leads to that happening that way. So they move on and try to design a research goal. They will first form a hypothesis of what they think is going on in that process. Then they will test that hypothesis. They will record the data, draw conclusions from that data, and these steps right here might repeat, right, over and over again until they think that they have found the answer. And then an important component of science is replication. So other scientists might come by and try to replicate their results. Okay, let's practice. I would like you to come up with a hypothesis of what is going on in this photograph, and try to think of a hypothesis that is a statement, is predictive, it's very specific, and is testable. Pause the video if you need more time. Alright, let's think about a hypothesis together. So we might make an observation. Well, the grass doesn't grow directly underneath the trees. What is going on here? We might think, well, the trees are creating shade, and the grass needs more light to grow. So, therefore, the grass is not growing directly under the tree. Alternatively, perhaps the trees take so much water out of the ground, divert water away from the grass, and therefore there's not enough water there for the grass to grow. First hypothesis might be a lack of sunlight causes the grass not to grow around the tree. And we could test that, right? We could come in and artificially put some lights there and see if the grass starts growing. And that's a testable hypothesis. We've been very specific, we've made a prediction, and we've formed our hypothesis in the form of a statement. Alright, here's another one. So you go out to Palm Springs or Palm Desert, and you see almost everything is extremely dry, everything has a desert, tundra, everything is kind of shades of gray and beige. And in the middle you have this cluster of palm trees. So you might wonder what's going on. Why do all those trees grow right there? And let's come up with a hypothesis. What do you think it is? When I went to Palm Desert, I saw these things. So you might come up with a theory, with the idea. I think that there's probably some water there. Some water has aggregated there, either because it's at the bottom of that valley, or because there's some natural source of water there, and that's why those palm trees are growing there. So let's make a hypothesis. Let's create a statement that we can use in an experiment. So our statement might be, palm trees grow in that particular location because there is a natural source of water and because water accumulates there at the bottom of that valley. So that's a statement that's predictive. We can test that, and it's very specific. Here's our final practice of hypothesis. So this is going to be a class on ecology, and you've probably seen very basic food chains at some point in your life. So in this food chain, we're looking at our primary producer, the tree, which is taking in sunlight and using photosynthesis to build itself. And then we have our primary consumer, the squirrel, eating the tree and other vegetation. And then we have our secondary consumer, the fox, which eats the squirrels. So let's just focus on these three elements right here. What if humans come and hunt all the foxes and decimate their population? What is our hypothesis on how that's going to affect other components of the food chain? So let's come up with a specific hypothesis. Why don't you take a minute to try to come up with one? Okay, so let's think about this. We need a statement that is predictive and testable, right, and specific. So our statement might sound something like, when foxes are removed from that ecosystem, the squirrel population is going to increase due to a lack of predation, and therefore the vegetation population, the trees and the green elements of the ecosystem are going to be reduced because of the enhancement in the number of the primary consumer of the squirrel. So that's a very specific hypothesis that we can test. Science is based on tests and experiments. So we use observations and preliminary knowledge and preliminary experiments and previous knowledge, and all of these things, all of this collective of knowledge that we have, we utilize to create a hypothesis. We can test our hypothesis by designing more experiments. From this we have observed facts, and we are going to make our own conclusions about these facts. Another scientist might come along and make a different conclusion. But the data is the data. Our numbers are the numbers. And different people might actually come to different conclusions from the same data. Science absolute truth does not exist in science. And that means that even though we can prove a phenomenon, and we can prove that it's 99.9999999% likely to be because of a scientific process that we proposed, it's never 100%. So you can be almost completely sure, but never 100% sure. So once again, our scientific method is that we're going to observe and describe a phenomenon. That's always step one. We're going to create a hypothesis to explain the phenomenon. We're going to predict and test it, right? We're going to run experiments and make conclusions based on that, on the results from the experiment, and other scientists will come along and there will be some independent verification. So I hope that from this section you've learned a lot about scientific method and hypotheses and all of those fun things that scientists deal with.